Welcome back, focused learners, to today's explainer. Have you ever looked at a photograph of a crime scene and just seen a static, still, maybe even quiet room? Well, today we're going to completely flip that perspective. I want you to look at a crime scene not as a quiet space, but as violent motion that has been literally frozen in time. Every scattered object, every single drop of blood, is a paused frame in a highly dynamic event. And our goal today is to uncover exactly how experts unlock that paused frame.
Okay, let's dive into this. The core problem we're looking at today is honestly fascinating. How do investigators take a chaotic, frozen aftermath and, well, rewind it? How do they turn scattered microscopic clues into a really clear visual narrative? And crucially, how do they translate that into dynamic visuals that capture the absolute motion of the crime to attract and captivate their ultimate audience, specifically a judge and jury? It's a meticulous, high-stakes process of visual storytelling.
So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, securing the crime scene. Second, capturing light and motion. Third, tracing the bloody action. And finally, reconstructing the final story. Kicking things off with Section 1, securing the crime scene, or as I like to think of it, freezing the chaos. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer pressure of the situation. The absolute very first step in reading the story of a crime is aggressively freezing that chaos. The physical evidence has to be preserved exactly as it was left, right? Otherwise, the story gets completely rewritten by mistake. This places immense pressure on the initial responding officers. Arriving at the scene means immediately mitigating threats and controlling dangerous persons. An officer has to assume the crime is ongoing until proven otherwise. They must promptly secure boundaries while maintaining extreme vigilance, constantly balancing the safety of victims and bystanders with the absolute necessity of freezing the scene. And this initial response builds into a really rigorous four-step procedure. First, secure and assess the area. Second, establish physical boundaries. And honestly, you usually want to push these boundaries out much further than you think you need. Because, well, you can always shrink a boundary later, but expanding it once a reporter has casually walked through your crime scene? Yeah, impossible. Third, conduct an initial walkthrough to spot fragile evidence. And fourth, prioritize the collection of that evidence. This ensures the static space remains completely uncontaminated by unauthorized personnel, the weather, or even the first responders themselves. According to standard investigative handbooks, these strict protocols are absolutely vital to protect what we call transient evidence. Think of a faint odor, a tire track in the mud, or a single drop of blood in the rain. If the scene isn't perfectly secured, that transient evidence, that tiny whisper of frozen motion, will just vanish forever. Moving right along to Section 2, capturing light and motion, documenting the scene.
So once the scene is frozen and secure, how do investigators visually document it to bring its hidden details to life in a courtroom? They rely on a tool called technical photography. And just to be clear, this isn't your standard point-and-shoot holiday photography. Technical photography is defined by 4 strict rules. It must be correctly exposed, have maximum depth of field, be totally free from distortion, and sit in razor-sharp focus. This is the crucial tool used to meticulously capture shadow, light, and perspective without accidentally misleading the viewer.
But here's the catch. Capturing the true depth of a scene is incredibly difficult. A standard automatic flash often fails because light falls off quickly due to the inverse square law. Basically, light loses its intensity exponentially the further it travels. So you end up with bright foregrounds and pitch black backgrounds where evidence could be hiding. To solve this, photographers use some pretty dynamic techniques. They use high dynamic range, or HDR, which merges multiple bracketed exposures to reveal hidden details in deep shadows. And at night, they use an amazing technique called painting with light. They leave the shutter open for an extended time and manually fire flashes to illuminate massive areas. It creates a deeply compelling visual that captures the true scale and motion of the event. On top of that, investigators have to meticulously control the depth of field. They typically rely on a 50mm normal lens because it provides the absolute best, most accurate human perspective. Long or short lenses, they distort distances and can totally mislead a jury. By manipulating the camera's f-stop to a smaller opening, like f/22, they create this incredibly deep plane of focus. And why does this matter so much? Because everything from the gun on the floor, right next to the camera, to the body 10 feet away has to be crystal clear. If it's out of focus, an opposing attorney is going to dispute it in a heartbeat. All right, jumping into Section 3, tracing the bloody action, analyzing bloodstains. We've talked about freezing the scene and photographing it, but how do we actually see the motion? Well, biological evidence, specifically bloodstains, literally draws a geometric map of the crime. Analysts use spatter to find two key things: the area of convergence, which is your 2D starting point on a flat plane, and the area of origin, which is the 3D estimation of exactly where the victim and suspect were in space. Investigators use elastic strings, protractors, trigonometry. They literally trace straight lines through the long axis of individual blood drops right back to their intersecting point. Add some height calculations, and suddenly they've reconstructed exactly where the violence happened in 3D space. So the crucial point here is understanding the difference between these types of stains. Passive blood stains, like pools or drops falling straight down at a 90-degree angle, they form these passive, near-perfect spheres because of surface tension. But impact spatter? Entirely different beast. It forms violent, concentrated drops with crystal-clear directional trajectories. The shape of these drops visually illustrates the extreme force and motion behind the bloodshed. It's so vivid that the jury can practically see the physical swing of a weapon right there in the courtroom. And of course, the body itself is the ultimate piece of evidence. Investigators carefully observe postmortem changes. They're checking for livor mortis, the settling of blood, rigor mortis, the stiffening of muscles, and algor, the temperature change of the body. By tracking these physiological changes at the scene, investigators can pinpoint the exact time the motion of life finally stopped. It essentially serves as a vital biological anchor for their whole timeline. Finally, we reach section 4, reconstructing the final story, stitching it together. So how do we take all of these isolated, carefully photographed moments and actually stitch them back together into a coherent chronological sequence? Well, physical visuals alone aren't always enough. Forensic guidelines stress that gathering antemortem data, which is biological information about a victim from before their death, is crucial. Investigators interview oral sources like family members, neighbors, maybe even fellow detainees, to gather context, life stories, and reports. This is especially vital when trying to identify skeletal remains. It adds much-needed human context to the cold, hard physical science. And to ensure this whole visual story actually holds up under cross-examination, every single step must be perfectly documented. This glossary excerpt highlights the need for precise, standardized terminology. You also have meticulous chain of custody logs, recording exactly who touched what piece of evidence, when, and where it was stored. If even a single link in that chain is broken, the entire visual story collapses under intense legal scrutiny. But when it's properly executed, it builds an incredibly compelling mini-narrative. We can literally trace a timeline backward, starting from the secured scene, captured through pristine technical photography, stepping back to the post-mortem changes that establish the time of death, tracking the suspect fleeing via footwear impressions in the mud, all the way back to the exact moment of initial impact defined by the 3D blood spatter. It is, for all intents and purposes, rewinding the tape of reality. And all of this painstaking work connects back to our ultimate audience, the judge and the jury. They rely on these curated, dynamic visuals that so vividly convey the motion of the crime to understand exactly what happened. More than that, they need them to apply complex federal sentencing guidelines. The visual story proves the specific permutations of criminal behavior, whether a crime happened at night, the exact level of force used, or the specific intent of the suspect. To put that into perspective, the precision of our visual evidence directly dictates justice. The United States Sentencing Commission outlines this massive grid with 43 offense levels across 4 sentencing zones. Depending on the visual evidence presented, how the blood spattered, where the footprints led, the exact depth of field proving a weapon's location, a defendant could land anywhere on this table. We're talking about outcomes ranging from 0 months to life in prison. The stakes are literally that high. And this brilliantly illustrates everything we've been talking about today. Crime scene reconstruction is the use of scientific methods, physical evidence, deductive reasoning, and their interrelationships to gain explicit knowledge of the series of events that surround the commission of a crime. It is, at its core, science and curated visuals working hand in hand to reconstruct the undeniable truth of the past. So the next time you see a photograph of a seemingly quiet, static space, remember what we uncovered today. Every single static piece of evidence is actually a dynamic story of motion, just waiting for the right visuals to attract an audience and tell its tale. It really makes you wonder, what hidden stories of frozen motion might be lying just beneath the surface of your own environment? Thank you so much for joining me for this Explainer Focus Learners. Keep observing and keep questioning.